London, 1899. The air smelled of coal smoke and fog, that thick, ghostly kind that turned street lamps into faint halos above cobblestones slick with rain. In a narrow room above Holborn, lit only by the pale glare of a single gas jet, a photographer named Silas Quinn prepared his last exposure of the day. He was not famous, though his work was respectable enough to keep him fed. Most of his clients were merchants, scholars, or families wishing to preserve the fleeting illusion of stability that the century's end seemed determined to dissolve. They came to Quinn's studio to freeze themselves in time, to trap their likeness in glass before progress erased it. That morning, the Havershams of Bloomsbury had arrived, punctual and polite. Arthur Haversham, a tall man with neatly oiled hair and the cautious posture of an academic, had requested a family portrait in their conservatory, to commemorate a new beginning, he said. His wife, Clara, pale and soft-spoken, carried herself like someone perpetually recovering from an illness. Their daughter, Eliza, perhaps 8 years old, clutched a wooden doll with glass eyes that caught the light like two small mirrors. The location was unusual. Quinn typically preferred his controlled studio, but Arthur had insisted on the greenhouse, a structure of glass and iron that shimmered faintly with condensation. The light in there, Arthur explained, is like no other. It remembers more than it should. Quinn, amused but intrigued, agreed. The family posed beneath the arched ribs of the glasshouse while the afternoon light slid across the tiled floor. Behind them, rows of orchids and ferns swayed faintly in the draft. Quinn adjusted the brass lens of his camera and lifted the dark cloth over his head. He glanced once more at his subjects, the father's hand firm on his daughter's shoulder, the mother's faint smile brittle as porcelain, then counted aloud. "What to?" The shutter clicked. The glass plate drank in the moment, turning sunlight into silver memory. But as Quinn stepped back, he noticed something, a brief shimmer in the reflection behind them. For the smallest fraction of a second, he thought he saw movement in the glass of the greenhouse door, a figure standing just beyond, watching. He lowered his camera, expecting to find a gardener or servant. The doorway, however, was empty. Only the faint smell of ozone lingered in the damp air. He dismissed it as fatigue. Later, as he developed the plate in his darkroom, the image bloomed like a ghost on the silvered surface. The Havershams emerged from shadow, crisp and still, their eyes fixed eternally upon him. It was only when he examined the reflection in the greenhouse glass that he felt his chest tighten. There, faint but undeniable, stood a man who did not belong. He was positioned behind Eliza, his figure caught in the shimmer of the reflection. His features were indistinct, blurred by the glass, but the posture was unmistakably deliberate. Upright, facing the camera, one hand raised slightly as though caught mid-wave. In his other hand, he held something that seemed to glow. Quinn leaned closer, heart pounding. The glow had no source, no match flame, no lantern, no sunlight. It was a pale blue radiance, impossibly bright even in the black and white emulsion. Worse still, the reflected man's eyes were open wide, his gaze fixed directly upon the lens. Quinn tried to wipe the glass, thinking it a residue of the chemicals. The figure remained. He checked the negative again and again, certain he'd made an error. Double exposure, light leak, anything rational. But the anomaly was consistent. The man was there. And what chilled Quinn to the bone was not the impossibility of the image, but the expression it captured, the faint curve of a smile, as though the figure knew he was being seen. By dawn, Quinn packed the photograph carefully in a tin box and delivered it to the Haversham residence, saying nothing of what he'd seen. Arthur accepted it with a look of satisfaction. "Perfect," he murmured. "Exactly as I'd hoped." When Quinn asked if he might keep a duplicate for his records, Arthur's demeanor changed. His eyes, normally mild, sharpened with quiet warning. "No," he said softly. "This one must remain unique. The moment it holds cannot be repeated." That night, Quinn awoke to the sound of footsteps outside his door. When he peered into the corridor, there was no one there, only the faint reflection of his own face in the window pane, lit by the dull blue glow of a gas lamp. For an instant, he thought he saw another figure standing just behind him, inside the glass. He never took another photograph again. And so the Haversham photograph, a simple family portrait, printed on glass and sealed in silence, began its long and haunted journey through time, waiting to be seen again. London, 1984. 85 years had passed since anyone had spoken the name Haversham aloud. The house on Bloomsbury's Keppel Street had long since been demolished, its gardens paved over to make way for a parking lot behind the university. What remained of the family existed only in fragments: letters without envelopes, receipts for gaslight fixtures, a burial certificate for Clara Haversham dated 1903, and a single photograph. It resurfaced one damp October morning, buried deep within a shipment of neglected glass negatives donated to the Royal Photographic Society archives. Most of the plates were unremarkable: portraits, architectural studies, faded landscapes eaten away by fungus. But among them, wrapped in wax paper and twine, was a box labeled in fine copperplate script: Haversham, Conservatory, April 17, 1899. The box came across the desk of Dr. Eleanor Cross, a restoration specialist whose life revolved around salvaging the fragile ghosts of Victorian photography. She was meticulous, patient to the point of obsession, the kind of woman who could spend hours watching the silver salts of an image bloom beneath the developer's surface as though it were an act of resurrection. When she unwrapped the Haversham plate, her first thought was how well preserved it was. The emulsion had barely cracked, the tones were rich, and the image, once inverted, was hauntingly crisp. She saw the family immediately: father, mother, child, arranged like actors on a small domestic stage beneath the iron ribs of a greenhouse. But it was the reflection that caught her attention. At first glance, it looked like an artifact of light, a trick of the glass where the photographer had stood. Yet when she magnified the image through the microscope, she felt a tightening in her stomach. The reflection did not match the expected geometry. The man in the glass, not the father, not the photographer, appeared to stand at an impossible angle, his head turned directly toward the camera while the others faced forward. And then there was the object. In his left hand, the figure held something oblong and metallic. Even under monochrome, the object emitted a faint halo, as though radiating light in a medium that should not record it. Eleanor checked the catalog's metadata. Glass negative, collodion process, 1899, it read. She frowned. There was no possible way for a wet plate to capture illumination as light itself. The process was chemically incapable of that. Intrigued, she decided to scan the negative under infrared. The results made her sit back in disbelief. Hidden beneath the grayscale tones were traces of blue and white spectrums, color frequencies. Not chemical contamination, not corrosion, actual embedded chromatic data. It was quite literally impossible. The next day, she brought the anomaly to her supervisor, Dr. Leonard Vance, head of archival studies. He peered through the microscope, chuckled politely, and said, "It's likely a manufacturing defect. A bubble or flake in the silver halide." Eleanor nodded, but she wasn't convinced. Manufacturing defects didn't stare back. Over the next several nights, she ran further tests. Under polarized light, the reflected man's eyes seemed unnaturally sharp, more defined than any other part of the plate. When she digitally enhanced the scan, she discovered what looked like a second reflection nested within the first, as if two separate images had been exposed on top of one another. At magnification, she could even make out faint parallel lines running down the surface of the object the man was holding, lines arranged in a grid, precise and regular. The pattern looked eerily similar to the pixel matrices she'd seen on modern display screens. The thought made her laugh, at first, but the laughter faded as she realized that the glow, the angle, and the outline of the figure all pointed to something disturbingly contemporary. The man looked as if he were watching the photograph being taken from another time entirely. On her seventh night working late, she printed a high-resolution enlargement for closer study. The lab's fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied. As the print emerged from the developer, Eleanor froze. The reflection had shifted. It wasn't a trick of her eyes, she was certain of it. The man's face appeared slightly turned now, his gaze angled not toward the original photographer but toward her. Heart pounding, she turned off the lab lights. In the darkness, the chemicals still faintly glowed, and for the briefest second she thought she saw the same pale blue radiance shimmer across the surface of the wet print, the same hue recorded in the impossible plate from 1899. The following morning, when Eleanor returned to her lab, the entire wing of the archive was sealed off with yellow tape. Her supervisor stood by the door, expression unreadable. "Ministry request," he said quietly. "They've taken the negatives for independent analysis." Eleanor demanded to know who they were. Dr. Vance only smiled a little too politely. That night, from her apartment window overlooking the Thames, Eleanor saw a white van parked near the archive entrance. Two men in dark coats carried out a lead line case between them. For a moment, under the streetlight, she saw the reflection of its handle flash faintly blue. Dr. Eleanor Cross had always believed that history left fingerprints, smudges of personality that clung to documents, ink, and dust. After the ministry seized the glass plate, she spent weeks haunted by its image. The reflection of that impossible man followed her into her dreams, flickering at the edges of memory like an afterimage burned into the retina. When official channels refused to answer her letters, she began her own investigation. Through the London Metropolitan Archives, she unearthed a thin folder labeled Haversham, Arthur, 1890 to 1909. Inside were faded legal documents, a few property deeds, and a series of private correspondences that had never been catalogued. The story they told was fragmented, but chillingly vivid. Arthur Haversham had been born in 1858, the only son of a textile merchant. Educated at King's College, he had studied natural philosophy and experimental optics, writing early papers on the refractive properties of gaslight through tinted glass. By all accounts, he was brilliant and peculiar. One colleague described him as a man who treats light as if it were a living thing. After his marriage to Clara Whitcomb in 1888, he inherited a modest estate in Bloomsbury and built a private laboratory adjoining his greenhouse. The surviving architectural plans showed intricate gas piping and small mirrors arranged along the interior walls, far more elaborate than any amateur botanist would require. Among the papers, Eleanor found a letter from Haversham to a fellow scientist, dated March 1899. "I believe, dear Edward, that light retains memory. Not merely reflection, not illusion, but recollection. Each photon bears witness to its journey through time. If only we could coax it to reveal what it has seen." He spoke of constructing a chamber of luminous recall, using mirrors lined with mercury and quartz. He believed certain frequencies could bend light backward, allow the present to observe its own past. Eleanor paused when she read that phrase, observe its own past. It sounded like madness, and yet, it also sounded eerily consistent with the anomalies she had seen on the Haversham plate. The letters continued in increasingly erratic handwriting. By April 1899, Arthur wrote of a presence that appeared during his late-night experiments. "The glass hums," Clara says. "She grows frightened of the light, but I cannot stop now. The reflection no longer mimics me. It delays, hesitates, as though deciding whether to follow. I think it watches." Eleanor's pulse quickened as she read. The date was less than 2 weeks before the photograph had been taken. The following correspondence came from Clara herself, written to her sister in Bath. "Arthur spends every evening in the conservatory. The air smells of metal and thunder. He says he is close to capturing a moment that will not die. Sometimes little Eliza wakes crying, claiming there is a man in the glass who waves to her. Arthur laughs, but I have seen him too, just once, standing behind the panes when my husband was nowhere near." The letter ended abruptly, as if torn mid-sentence. Eleanor pressed further, combing through death certificates, parish records, and newspapers. She found Clara's obituary, dated June 1903, consumption, it said, though one coroner's note mentioned severe dermal burns consistent with electrical discharge. No one questioned it further. After Clara's death, Arthur withdrew completely. Servants reported strange flashes from the greenhouse late at night, blue-white light like lightning caught in a bottle. By 1909, the house had been vacated entirely. The final record was a missing persons notice for Eliza Haversham, age 18, last seen entering the conservatory and never emerging again. The police investigation ended with a single remark in the file. Structure found empty. All glass surfaces warped as if exposed to intense heat. No trace of the girl. Eleanor sat alone in the archive's reading room, the hum of fluorescent lights above her blending into a faint ringing in her ears. She turned the pages slowly, fingertips trembling, half expecting to see her own name scrawled in the margins. Then she found the last item in the folder, a laboratory sketch. It depicted the conservatory's central frame, annotated with measurements and a note at the bottom written in Arthur's hand. Subject: light retention apparatus. Function: to stabilize the image across temporal boundaries. Observation: the glass no longer reflects me as I am, only as I shall be. The handwriting broke off there, the ink smeared as though the pen had been pulled away mid-stroke. Eleanor stared at the page until her eyes blurred. The phrase "as I shall be" echoed in her head like a whisper through time. She thought of the reflection's pale grin, of the object glowing impossibly blue in the photograph. She remembered the warning her supervisor had given her when the ministry took the plate, that she should let the past remain buried. But now she knew the past was not buried at all. It was looking back. Professor Malcolm Reed was not a man inclined toward superstition. His world revolved around formulas, not phantoms, instruments, not intuition. Yet when the ministry's division of temporal phenomena quietly reached out to him in the winter of 1985, their proposal was too peculiar and too tempting to refuse. The courier who delivered the envelope wore no insignia. Inside, Reed found a letter stamped "Confidential, Scientific Consultation Required," accompanied by a single 8x10 photographic print. The image was unmistakably Victorian. A family posed beneath a greenhouse arch, the father's expression dignified, the mother's distant, the child rigidly still. But what drew Reed's attention was the reflection behind them, the luminous figure holding what looked like a modern device. He assumed, initially, that it was an elaborate hoax. But the accompanying note changed his mind. Original glass negative verified to be from April 17, 1899. No evidence of alteration or double exposure. Emission spectrum of reflected object inconsistent with any 19th century light source. Your analysis is requested. Reed leaned back in his chair, the hum of his computer lab surrounding him. Anachronistic light emission, the phrase thrilled him. For years he had studied temporal refraction, the theory that time, under certain electromagnetic conditions, might behave like a lens, bending, distorting, even reflecting moments rather than merely recording them. The photograph, if genuine, was the first evidence that such distortion could be captured. 2 weeks later, he was granted access to the artifact itself, the original Haversham glass plate, under the watch of 2 plainclothes ministry agents at the Royal Archives Underground Lab. The negative lay inside a nitrogen-sealed case, resting on velvet as though it were a religious relic. Reed approached it with reverence. "A century-old enigma," he murmured. "Let's see what you've been hiding." Under magnification, the details were breathtaking. The glass was pristine, the emulsion perfectly stable. And there, just as in the print, was the man in the reflection. Sharper, cleaner, more vivid than any other figure. Reed adjusted the optical scanner, tracing the contours of the glowing object in the man's hand. The readings made no sense. The light signature contained periodic frequency gaps, forming a pattern identical to that of modern liquid crystal displays. The probability of such a pattern occurring naturally, or through chemical decay, was statistically impossible. The glass, in short, contained a record of technology that wouldn't exist for 70 more years. When he reported his findings, the ministry official overseeing the project, a quiet, unsmiling man who introduced himself only as Mr. Harrow, asked him to continue his analysis in secrecy. "You are not to speak of this outside the department," Harrow said. "If your results prove credible, you'll be working on something history isn't ready to understand." Reed, fascinated and unnerved, complied. Over the following months, he subjected the plate to every test available: spectrography, X-ray crystallography, even magnetic resonance imaging. The results grew stranger each time. The glass contained microfractures, microscopic striations, that pulsed faintly under laser light, almost like interference waves. When plotted, the waveforms resembled temporal parallax, as though the photograph captured not one instant but many, folded atop one another like the layers of a dream. One night, while alone in the lab, Reed ran a high-frequency pulse through the scanner. For a brief moment, the reflection in the greenhouse shimmered on the monitor. He froze. The man's hand, the one holding the luminous object, seemed to move. Only slightly, a tremor of motion too quick to be mechanical. He replayed the scan again and again. The image remained static, until the 12th pass, when the shimmer appeared once more, this time accompanied by a faint distortion in the surrounding glass, like ripples in water. Reed stepped back, heart hammering. It wasn't possible. Photographs didn't move. And yet, as he stood there in the flickering fluorescence, he had the uncanny sense that the figure inside the photograph had turned its head slightly, not toward the original camera, but toward him. The next morning, Harrow ordered the experiment log sealed. The photograph, he said, is to be considered a controlled temporal anomaly. Reed argued that it was evidence, perhaps proof, of a phenomenon that could revolutionize physics. If light can record across time, he said, then every beam, every photon, is a messenger from the future. Harrow's expression remained cold. Perhaps, he replied, but not every message should be read. That night, unable to sleep, Reed printed the scans for his private notes. He stared for hours at the reflection of the man with the glowing object, tracing the faint outline of his face. There was something disturbingly familiar in the man's features, a shape of jaw, a slope of brow. It wasn't until dawn, with the early light spilling through his window, that he realized why the face unsettled him so deeply. The reflection, blurred though it was, looked exactly like him. It was a gray afternoon when Dr. Eleanor Cross received the call. The voice on the other end, an archivist from the British Library's Acquisitions Department, spoke her name with the careful tone used when delivering something both exciting and unnerving. "We've uncovered a series of estate papers from the Haversham property," the man said. "Most are bills, receipts, trivial correspondences. But there's a child's diary among them, dated between 1898 and 1899. We thought you might want to look." Within the hour, Eleanor was on the train to the archive. The diary was smaller than she expected, no bigger than her palm, its leather cover cracked and faded, the brass clasp bent with age. Inside, the pages were brittle but surprisingly legible. In neat looping cursive, the first page read, "Eliza Margaret Haversham. My journal. Christmas, 1898. Eleanor began to read, her fingertips trembling as though she were holding a living thing. January 3, 1899. Father says he will make the flowers bloom all year. He stays in the greenhouse even when it's cold. The glass hums when he turns the lights on. Sometimes I think the plants are singing back. February 10, 1899. Mother doesn't like Father's experiments. She says the air smells wrong. Father told her that the light needs time to settle. He says time is only a trick of our eyes. I don't understand, but I like how the lights dance on the walls when he works. They make my dolls glow. March 2, 1899. A man came to the garden today. I didn't see him walk through the gate. I just looked up and there he was, standing behind the glass door, smiling. He waved at me. When I told Father, he said no one was there. But I know what I saw. He had a light in his hand, like a little lantern that shone blue. March 14, 1899. Father shouted at the gardener for touching his instruments. He says the reflections are changing, that they don't always show what's real. I peeked through the glass when he wasn't looking, and I saw the man again, standing next to Father's reflection, though Father was across the room. The blue light was brighter this time. It hurt my eyes. March 28, 1899. Mother has moved her things to the guest room. She prays every night now. She says Father has opened a door that should stay closed. Father says she's frightened because she doesn't understand science. But I don't think it's science anymore. I heard the glass whisper my name last night. April 9, 1899. Father says he will take a photograph next week to prove his discovery. He says the camera can capture what the eye cannot. He asked me to wear my best dress. I asked if the bright man would be in the picture. Father laughed, but then he looked sad. He said, "If he is, we mustn't look at him directly." April 17, 1899. The bright man came again. The air was heavy and buzzing. I saw my reflection in the glass, but it moved before I did. Father told me to stand still for the photograph. When the shutter clicked, the humming stopped, like someone had held their breath. Father said the experiment worked. But the bright man didn't leave. He's still in the glass. I can see him when the room is dark. Eleanor paused. The next pages were nearly blank, save for smudges of graphite and faint indentations, as though Eliza had pressed hard with her pencil before erasing. The final entry, written in an uneven hand, made Eleanor's blood run cold. April 19, 1899. Father says the light has memory. I think it remembers me. Last night I dreamed I was inside the glass. Everything shimmered and bent. The bright man spoke without moving his mouth. He said he came from the other side of the photograph. He said he's waiting for me when the light comes again. The handwriting ended abruptly. Eleanor closed the book, pulse hammering. The diary had the weight of authenticity. Its paper fibers matched the 19th century pulp used by London stationers, and the ink had bled in the distinctive way of iron gall. There was no forgery here. She requested to see the rest of the estate documents. Among the loose papers, one item caught her attention, a receipt for a photographic sitting signed by S. Quinn, the same photographer who had taken the now infamous glass plate. The date matched Eliza's final entry exactly, April 17, 1899. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. The coincidence was too perfect, the connections too clean. The girl's words were not imagination. She had described the figure before the photograph was even taken. But one detail chilled her more than any other, something she hadn't noticed at first. On the diary's inside cover, scrawled faintly in graphite, were two words, almost erased but still visible under angled light. Don't blink. The photograph had been examined before, yes, by archivists, historians, and even Reed himself. Yet when it returned to the lab for more extensive study in early 1986, a new series of anomalies emerged that no previous analysis had fully captured. The ministry had installed a high-resolution spectral scanner, capable of dissecting light at nanometer increments. Reed leaned over the monitor, already sensing that what he was about to see would challenge his rational mind more than anything in his career. The figure was no longer a peripheral detail. When magnified, the man behind the greenhouse glass, the bright man Eliza had described, exhibited optical properties inconsistent with 19th century physics. Every fiber of his clothing reflected light differently, some surfaces absorbing certain wavelengths entirely, others scattering them in impossible arcs. Dr. Reed tapped the keyboard. Algorithms traced every shadow, reflection, and angular anomaly. The figure's shadows did not obey classical rules. Even accounting for the glass's reflective distortion, the light patterns indicated a secondary source, a source physically absent at the time. Shadows converged in a way that would be mathematically impossible in the afternoon sun of April 17, 1899. He adjusted the spectral contrast further. The figure's hand, holding the rectangular luminous object, glowed faintly, emitting low-intensity light in a coherent, structured spectrum. Not sunlight, not candlelight, not even the faint gas illumination of the greenhouse. The emitted light behaved like a controlled display of photons, akin to modern digital screens. Liquid crystal, LED, or any other 20th century technology could not exist yet, not for decades. And yet, here it was, captured on glass. Reed's assistant, a young physicist named Lydia Marsh, leaned closer. Her eyes widened. It's like the figure is half a hologram, half solid person, she whispered. Every reflection, every shadow interacts with the scene perfectly, but it shouldn't. It's alive. Not alive, Reed said cautiously, but a projection of something, somewhere, somehow. They began a pixel-by-pixel analysis. When overlaying the image with mathematical models of light diffusion and refraction, they realized the figure's edges did not match the physical boundaries of the greenhouse glass or the ambient room. In some areas, his form appeared slightly displaced in space, as if partially phased between two planes. The blue rectangle in his hand projected onto the surfaces around him in a way that implied it existed in 3 dimensions outside the normal coordinates of the photograph. Reed's fingers trembled as he rotated the 3D simulation. The figure shifted slightly, though it had not moved on the plate. Each time they ran the scan, the spatial irregularities remained constant. Every new measurement confirmed a single, terrifying reality. The figure was impossible. And yet, it obeyed all observable rules. He reflected light, cast shadows, and even altered the ambient illumination of the greenhouse when viewed through the spectral scanner. It was as though he was there in the room but simultaneously belonged to a different era. A different set of physical laws. Reed recalled Eliza Haversham's diary, the description of the blue light, the hovering figure that could appear and vanish at will. Every word she had written seemed to correspond perfectly to what they were now witnessing scientifically. The child's memory had not been imagination, it had been observation. Pushing further, Reed analyzed the light emissions themselves. He discovered a minute temporal anomaly embedded in the photons. Different portions of the figure's form were illuminated by light that, when measured for decay and atomic excitation, belonged to slightly different periods in time. Not seconds, not minutes. Some components of the figure had been exposed in increments of years apart. He rubbed his eyes. The implications were staggering. If the analysis was correct, then the photograph contained evidence of time overlap. A single physical image recording multiple temporal layers simultaneously. "The light doesn't lie," Lydia said. Her voice trembled with awe. "But how can something physically impossible still be captured in reality?" Reed could only shake his head. "We're witnessing a phenomenon that defies every law we know. It's not just an optical illusion or a trick of the camera, it's a crack in the fabric of time itself." 4 days, they labored in silence, running repeated scans. Each test reaffirmed the impossibility. The figure's clothing, its posture, the object it held, even the way his eyes reflected the greenhouse interior, all anachronistic. All real. And yet, there was no explanation within any conventional framework. The most disturbing discovery came late one night. Reed overlaid multiple scans of the same figure under different wavelengths of light. There it was, a faint echo, a secondary outline barely visible behind the main form, a shadow of himself, or perhaps a glimpse of something else entirely, slightly offset, as if the figure itself existed in 2 times at once. Reed whispered to himself, "It isn't just impossible. It's living between moments." And that, he realized with a sinking chill, was only the beginning. By the end of spring 1986, the Haversham photograph had become more than a curiosity. It had become a phenomenon that defied logic, physics, and the very notion of historical reality. News of the ministry's discoveries remained classified, but the photograph itself had begun circulating quietly among specialized scholars, physicists, historians, parapsychologists, and optical engineers, each compelled by a mixture of awe and terror. Dr. Reed convened a team to systematically examine every anomaly. First were the physicists, drawn by the temporal irregularities embedded in the figure's light. Professor Alan Kerr, a theoretical physicist from Cambridge, proposed the temporal fold hypothesis. According to Kerr, specific atmospheric conditions, the precise combination of humidity, temperature, electromagnetic fields, and the composition of the photographic emulsion, could theoretically create a brief, localized folding of spacetime, a microscopic overlap between moments separated by decades. In simpler terms, the photograph might have captured a person from the future standing in the past. The implications were staggering. Kerr's calculations suggested that the bright man in the photograph could, in some sense, exist simultaneously in 2 centuries, a phenomenon so rare that the odds of capturing it were effectively zero. Yet the light patterns and shadow behaviors in the Haversham photograph matched precisely what Kerr's model predicted. There was no margin for error. Every reflection, every angular distortion, every variance in photon decay corresponded to a temporal anomaly. Next came the historians. Dr. Evelyn Armitage, a specialist in 19th-century social history, focused on the clothing and objects held by the figure. To her shock, the fabric of his coat reflected synthetic fibers not commercially produced until the 1940s, while the rectangular object in his hand emitted a faint glow characteristic of a liquid crystal display, technology not realized until the 1960s. Armitage noted that the combination of these anachronisms could not be explained by forgery, as any manipulation would have left detectable chemical traces on the glass plate, traces which simply did not exist. "It's as if someone walked out of time," she murmured during one late evening session. Her voice barely carried over the hum of the lab scanners. The materials, the light, the positioning, nothing in 1899 could account for this. Then there were the parapsychologists. Dr. Marianne Vos, a respected researcher in psychic phenomena, proposed a more metaphysical explanation: psychic projection across time. She argued that Eliza Haversham's vivid descriptions in her diary were not childish fantasy but evidence of latent psychic sensitivity. In Vos's view, the child's consciousness might have somehow imprinted the figure onto the photographic plate, a phenomenon where the mind interacts with the physical world in ways that transcend conventional physics. Vos cited recurring motifs in the diary: the blue light, the fading presence, the echo of reflections that did not match reality. "This is not a trick of light or lens," she insisted. "This is a psychic phenomenon that imprints temporal echoes." Eliza saw what we now see: a living projection from another era, possibly from her own future or an alternate timeline. Finally, the skeptics arrived. Led by Dr. Conrad Havelock, a quantum chemist, they proposed a more grounded but equally unsettling theory: quantum interference in chemical emulsions. According to Havelock, under extraordinarily precise conditions, the silver halides in the emulsion could interact with ambient electromagnetic fluctuations to produce structured patterns resembling coherent forms. In other words, the Haversham photograph could be the first documented case of chemical pareidolia at a molecular level, a quantum accident where random processes create something visually intelligible. Yet even Havelock admitted the flaws. If this were mere pareidolia, why did the figure adhere to realistic lighting, cast consistent shadows, and display material properties impossible for 1899? The explanation could account for randomness but could not explain intentionality: the figure's hand holding the glowing rectangle, the precise posture, the gaze seemingly aware of the camera's presence. By the end of their deliberations, the room of scientists, historians, and parapsychologists was unified in one unnerving truth: no single theory could fully explain the Haversham figure. Each perspective offered a piece of the puzzle, but none provided closure. Temporal folds, psychic projections, quantum anomalies, each plausible in isolation, yet insufficient when confronted with the photograph in its entirety. Reed's voice broke the uneasy silence. "We are staring at a phenomenon that transcends our understanding of time, matter, and reality itself," he said. "It may be that our fundamental assumptions about causality, linear history, and the permanence of the past are flawed." He leaned closer to the screen. The figure's faintly glowing hand, the impossible coat, the phasing shadows, all seemed to acknowledge the observer. It was no longer a passive image. It felt active, aware, and deeply alien. And for the first time, Reed allowed himself to consider the most terrifying possibility: that this figure was not confined to the photograph. That somehow, across more than a century, it persisted: a witness, a traveler, a being out of time, waiting silently for anyone brave enough to look closely. Theories would proliferate. Books would be written. Conferences would debate the implications. Yet the impossible figure remained, inscrutable and eternal, challenging the limits of human comprehension and daring anyone who studied it to accept that reality itself might not be what it seems. Decades have passed since the Haversham photograph first re-emerged from obscurity, yet the figure in the glass greenhouse remains as enigmatic as ever. It is no longer merely an archival curiosity. It has become a symbol of the unknowable, a testament to the limits of human understanding and the persistence of the unexplained. Scholars continue to study it, but the mystery has grown with each new technological advance rather than diminished. In the British Museum, the photograph now occupies a place of honor and caution. Encased in a custom climate-controlled display, it draws thousands of visitors annually. Researchers, casual historians, and the curious alike are captivated by the image, but many report experiences that go far beyond intellectual fascination. Some describe a sudden, overwhelming sense of recognition, as if they had encountered the figure before in a dream or a fleeting memory. Others feel a subtle pressure in the room, a sensation of being observed. Sensitive viewers occasionally glimpse flickering images within the figure's glowing object, glimpses of scenes that do not belong to any known reality. A cityscape with unfamiliar architecture, people in strange attire, machines flying silently overhead. The Haversham family, now spread across the UK and beyond, has maintained a peculiar tradition, one rooted in memory, caution, and perhaps fear. Every year on the anniversary of the photograph, April 17th, surviving descendants gather at the old greenhouse site, now part of private property preserved by caretakers who respect the family's unusual ritual. They remain in silent meditation for 8 seconds, the same duration that the original exposure required. Some describe visions of ancient ancestors standing beside them, whispering fragments of memory or warning. Others feel a temporary blurring of the past and present, as if multiple timelines converge within the garden's space. Emily Haversham, the last direct link to the original household, left a meticulous collection of journals detailing her lifelong encounters with temporal anomalies. In them, she recounted glimpses of people dressed in impossible fashions, carrying unfamiliar devices, and vanishing in ways that defied normal perception. Her writings suggest that these events were not isolated. The figure in the photograph may represent a continuing phenomenon, one that subtly intersects with the Haversham bloodline. Researchers who later accessed her archives noted a pattern of recurring experiences, suggesting that certain individuals might retain sensitivity to the figure or to the broader temporal distortions it seems to manifest. Modern technology has only deepened the mystery. In 2018, a team at Stanford University applied advanced artificial intelligence to the image, using algorithms trained to detect microanomalies in light and texture. The AI confirmed that the figure could not have been a product of conventional photography or manipulation. More astonishingly, it detected temporal discrepancies within the image. Minute regions of the figure's form seemed to exist slightly out of sync with the rest of the photograph, as though some parts of the scene belonged to a different era entirely. In 2021, a collaboration between NASA, ESA, and JAXA applied spectroscopic methods originally developed to study exoplanets. Their findings confirmed that isotopic variations in the silver halide crystals of the figure's image were inconsistent with the rest of the plate, suggesting that the figure had somehow interacted with energy fields unknown to early 20th century physics. Even the most conservative scientists were forced to concede that the phenomenon defies conventional explanation. The photograph has inspired not only scientific inquiry but philosophical speculation. Scholars debate whether it represents a glimpse into an alternate timeline, a quantum fluctuation, or a deliberate projection from the future. Others suggest it may be evidence that the universe is far more malleable than previously imagined, that linear time is an approximation, and that our perception of past, present, and future is incomplete. For the public, the photograph remains a source of fascination and unease. Visitors to the British Museum often describe subtle experiences, a sense of déjà vu, fleeting glimpses of unfamiliar eras reflected in nearby glass, or the uncanny sensation that the figure is aware of their observation. The museum maintains a logbook for these reports, which now contains hundreds of entries spanning decades. Patterns have emerged, but no explanation has satisfied the curious, the skeptical, or the fearful. The legacy of the Haversham photograph, then, is twofold. It is both a historical artifact and a living enigma, bridging the gap between science, history, and the supernatural. It challenges assumptions about causality, the integrity of the past, and the boundaries of human perception. The figure remains silent, yet its presence is palpable, a reminder that the universe may be stranger, more complex, and more intertwined with time than any of us can currently comprehend. And perhaps most hauntingly, there is a sense that the story is not finished. The figure may still be observing, still interacting with our timeline in subtle, imperceptible ways. Every new observation, every technological advancement, every careful study only raises more questions than answers. The Haversham photograph is no longer a relic of the past. It is an active window into the extraordinary, a challenge to the human mind, and a subtle but relentless reminder that some mysteries transcend centuries, science, and understanding itself. In the end, the photograph forces anyone who studies it to confront an uncomfortable truth. The past may not be immutable, the present may be only a thin veil, and the future may already be peeking through, waiting, silently, in the shadows of an ordinary glass plate.